There are stories that remain buried for decades, waiting for the right moment to resurface. A group of young ballerinas, full of dreams and ambition, vanished without a trace on the way to their most important performance. 32 years later, a mother on her deathbed discovers something chilling in an old photograph, something she never noticed before. What happened that night? Where did they go? And most importantly, why has someone been trying to keep this secret buried for so long? The truth is closer than you think, but some mysteries are meant to stay unsolved. Stay until the end, subscribe to the channel, and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. The past is calling, and it won't be ignored. The hospital room smelled of antiseptic and fading hope. Margaret Holloway lay in bed, her frail fingers trembling as she turned the pages of a worn photo album. Outside, the city pulsed with life, but within these walls, time moved differently, dragging itself forward in slow, painful increments. She could feel it, the end creeping closer, whispering in her ear, reminding her that soon, very soon, she would have to let go. But there was something unfinished, something unresolved, a weight that had never left her chest since that night 32 years ago, when her daughter Emily vanished along with her entire ballet class and their esteemed instructor, Richard Whitmore. Margaret had accepted it, or at least she had convinced herself she had. The police investigation had gone cold years ago, the search parties had disbanded, and people had moved on. Everyone except her. The absence of a body, the absence of answers, was like a wound that never healed. Emily had been only 16, full of life, grace, and a quiet kind of determination. She had loved ballet more than anything, practicing until her feet bled, dreaming of the day she would step onto the world's greatest stages. That night had been her moment, her grand performance, but she never made it to the theater. None of them did. Margaret traced her fingers over a photograph from the day before Emily disappeared. The entire ballet class stood together, smiling, their arms wrapped around each other in tight embraces of camaraderie. Mr. Whitmore stood at the center, his sharp, refined features framed by perfectly combed silver hair, a man who commanded both respect and admiration. But Margaret's focus wasn't on him. It was on something else, something she had never noticed before, something that made her breath hitch in her throat. The edge of the photograph had a small, almost imperceptible detail, a reflection in the large studio mirror behind the students. A shadowy figure stood in the background, slightly blurred but undeniably present. Margaret's heart pounded. How had she never seen this? Who was that? And why did Mr. Whitmore's expression seem tense, as if he had seen the figure himself? A knock at the door startled her. Nurse Sarah entered with a gentle smile, her eyes filled with the kind of pity Margaret had grown to resent. "Mrs. Holloway, are you doing okay? You've been awake for hours." Margaret barely heard her. Her fingers clenched around the photograph as she whispered, "I never saw this before." Sarah tilted her head. "What is it?" Margaret swallowed hard. "Something I should have noticed a long time ago." She turned the photo toward Sarah, pointing at the eerie reflection. "Tell me I'm not imagining this." Sarah leaned in, squinting. A slight frown creased her brow. "That's strange. Who is that?" Margaret's grip tightened. "I don't know." She suddenly felt a desperate urgency, a need to understand what this meant. This wasn't a coincidence. This wasn't just a trick of the light. It was something bigger, something that had been waiting for her to see it. Sarah hesitated. "Margaret, you've been through so much. Are you sure you want to open this door again? Maybe it's just an old smudge on the print." "No," Margaret interrupted, her voice uncharacteristically sharp. "No, this means something." The nurse sighed, concern etching her features. "Maybe Detective Harris could take a look. He worked on Emily's case, didn't he?" Margaret's chest ached at the name. James Harris had been young when he was assigned to Emily's case, fresh out of training, full of promise and determination. He had worked tirelessly longer than most, but even he had eventually walked away. She hadn't spoken to him in over a decade. Still, something in her gut told her this was the only path forward. That night, Margaret lay awake, the photograph resting on her bedside table. Sleep did not come easily. When it finally did, it brought with it a dream unlike any she had ever had before. Emily stood before her, unchanged, still 16, her blonde hair tied in a perfect ballet bun. Her blue eyes were filled with sadness, but her lips curved into a gentle smile. "Mom," she whispered, reaching out a delicate hand. "You found it." Margaret's throat tightened. "Emily, where are you?" But Emily only shook her head. "You have to see it for yourself." Margaret jolted awake, gasping, her heart racing. The room was dark, but something felt different. She turned to the bedside table. The photograph was gone. A chill ran down her spine. She wasn't alone. Margaret's breath came in shallow gasps as she scanned the room. Nothing was out of place. No sign of forced entry. But the photograph, it had vanished. She reached for the call button, her fingers shaking. But then, a soft creak. The sound came from the hospital window. Margaret's pulse pounded as she turned her head slowly. There, standing just outside, was a figure in the darkness, watching. And then, in an instant, it was gone. The next morning, Detective Harris arrived at the hospital, looking older, wearier, but still carrying that same sharp, observant gaze. He sat beside Margaret's bed, glancing at the untouched breakfast tray before meeting her eyes. "Sarah called me, said you found something." Margaret nodded, recounting everything: the photograph, the shadowy figure, the dream, the missing photo. Harris listened, his expression unreadable. When she finished, he exhaled slowly, rubbing a hand over his face. "I never told you this," he finally said, voice quiet. "But I had my doubts about this case from the beginning. There were too many inconsistencies, too many loose ends. I always believed someone was keeping something from us." Margaret swallowed hard. "Then help me. Find out who." Harris hesitated before nodding. "All right, but Margaret, if we open this door, we might not like what's on the other side." Margaret's hands trembled, but her voice was steady. "I don't care. I need to know." That afternoon, Harris retrieved an old case file from storage. He spread the faded documents across the hospital bed, each page a relic of a tragedy long buried. There were witness statements, photographs, timelines. And then, there was something Margaret hadn't seen before, a second version of the same ballet class photo. Margaret's heart nearly stopped. It was identical to the one she had, but in this one, the shadowy figure was missing. She looked up at Harris, fear creeping into her voice. Why would someone alter the original photo? Harris's jaw clenched. Because they didn't want you to see what was really there. A shiver ran down Margaret's spine. She stared at the empty space where the shadowy figure should have been, dread coiling in her stomach. Something was very, very wrong. And for the first time in years, Margaret felt it. Something dark, something unfinished. Something that had been waiting for her to find it. Margaret couldn't take her eyes off the altered photograph. Her fingers, wrinkled with age, trembled as they traced the empty space where the shadowy figure had once stood. The realization settled deep in her bones. Someone had tampered with the original evidence. Someone had deliberately tried to erase the truth. Her mind raced with questions, none of which had easy answers. Who had done this? Why had they gone to such lengths to hide whatever was in that mirror? And most importantly, what had she been meant to see? Harris sat across from her, his expression grim, eyes scanning the old case files as though hoping for a clue that had eluded him all those years ago. He exhaled sharply, rubbing his chin. "This doesn't make sense," he muttered. "This version of the photo, it's the one we had in our files. The one that was used in the investigation." Margaret's voice was barely above a whisper. "Which means the one I have, the one I just found, wasn't meant to be seen." Harris nodded. Someone kept the original hidden. Someone who knew that if the truth came to light, it would change everything. Margaret's pulse quickened. "Then we need to find out who." The detective leaned forward, his fingers tapping against the table as he thought. "Let's start at the beginning." That night, Emily and the rest of the class were on their way to the theater. The bus they were traveling in was last seen passing through downtown at 7:42 p.m. After that, he shook his head. It was as if they disappeared into thin air. No witnesses, no traces, no evidence of foul play. Margaret's throat tightened. She had replayed those details in her mind 1,000 times, always coming up empty. But someone knows what happened, she said, her voice firm. Someone has been hiding this for 32 years. Harris flipped through his notes. There was one person who claimed to have seen something that night. A woman named Evelyn Carter. She was a janitor working near the theater. Said she saw the bus stop at an intersection, but it never moved again. When she looked back a minute later, it was gone. Margaret's hands gripped the blanket over her lap. Did anyone follow up with her? Harris's expression darkened. We tried, but a week later, she resigned from her job and moved out of state. She wouldn't answer any more questions. Margaret shivered, like she was scared. Maybe, Harris said, or maybe she was told to keep quiet. He glanced at her. I can track her down. See if she's finally willing to talk. Margaret nodded, but something deep inside told her that Evelyn Carter wasn't the only person who had answers. She turned back to the photograph, staring at the ballet instructor's face. Richard Whitmore. He had been the shining star of the community, a man respected and revered, a mentor to so many young dancers. And yet, her gaze lingered on his eyes. There was something in them. Fear. Margaret had seen that expression before, on parents receiving bad news, on officers realizing a case was slipping through their fingers. It wasn't pride or confidence. It was dread. She closed her eyes, trying to recall every conversation she had ever had with Mr. Whitmore. He had always been kind to her, always polite, but there had been something distant about him, as if he was keeping her at arm's length. At the time, she had assumed it was just his personality. Now she wasn't so sure. Harris's voice pulled her from her thoughts. Margaret! She opened her eyes. He was holding a folder she had never seen before. I went through some of my old notes, he said carefully. There was something I forgot about. Something strange. He opened the file, revealing a document with Mr. Whitmore's name at the top. Margaret frowned. What is that? A name change request, Harris said. Filed a year before the disappearance. Margaret's breath hitched. He was trying to change his identity? Harris nodded. I don't know why, but he never followed through with it. He submitted the paperwork, then withdrew it weeks later. It was as if he wanted to disappear, but changed his mind. Margaret's pulse pounded. He knew something. He was afraid of something. Harris exhaled. That's what I'm starting to think. Margaret's thoughts swirled. If Whitmore had been afraid, if he had wanted to disappear, then maybe this wasn't just about a disappearance. Maybe it was about something bigger, something deeper. She thought about her dream, the way Emily had reached for her, the sadness in her eyes. You have to see it for yourself. Margaret swallowed hard. What was Emily trying to tell her? She looked at Harris. We need to find out everything we can about Whitmore, his past, his connections, anything that might explain why he would want to change his name. Harris nodded. I'll dig into it. He hesitated before adding, but Margaret, if we start pulling at these threads, we might find things we don't want to. Margaret's voice was steady. I don't care. That night, Margaret lay in bed staring at the ceiling. The shadows stretched across the room, shifting with the movement of the hospital's dim lights. Her body ached with exhaustion, but sleep didn't come. At some point, she drifted off, slipping into another dream. Emily was there again, standing in the same dimly lit space, her ballet shoes tapping softly against a wooden floor. She looked at Margaret with those familiar, sorrowful eyes. Mom, she whispered. Margaret stepped closer. Emily, where are you? Emily shook her head. You're not looking in the right place. Margaret frowned. What do you mean? Emily turned, raising her arm, pointing at something behind her. Margaret followed her gaze, and that's when she saw it. A mirror. A large, gilded mirror. Its glass clouded with something unnatural. Something wrong. Emily's reflection stood there, but it wasn't moving. Margaret's stomach twisted. Emily turned back to her, whispering, "Find the mirror." Margaret gasped, jolting awake. Her chest heaved as she took in her surroundings, her heart pounding. The room was quiet, the hospital monitors beeping steadily. But something was different. She turned to the bedside table and froze. The photograph was back, right where it had been the night before. Margaret's blood ran cold. And this time, when she looked at the reflection in the mirror behind the students, there was more than just one shadowy figure. There were many, standing still, watching. And suddenly, Margaret knew, whatever had happened that night 32 years ago, it wasn't over. Margaret sat frozen in her hospital bed, her eyes locked onto the photograph that had mysteriously reappeared on her bedside table. The room around her seemed to shrink, the air thick with an unseen presence pressing in on her chest. She wanted to tell herself she was imagining it, that the exhaustion and grief were making her see things that weren't there. But she knew better. She had spent her entire life dismissing the feeling that something wasn't right, that something had been deliberately hidden from her. Not anymore. Her trembling fingers reached for the photograph. Her breath hitched as she traced the reflection in the mirror behind the students. The single shadowy figure she had seen before was no longer alone. There were more now, dark silhouettes, barely visible but undeniably present. Standing, watching, waiting. A knock at the door made her jump. Detective Harris entered, carrying a manila folder, his expression a mixture of exhaustion and urgency. He paused when he saw her face, his brows furrowing. "Margaret, are you okay?" She swallowed hard, forcing herself to look away from the photograph. "It's back," she whispered. Harris frowned. "What is?" She lifted the picture with a shaky hand. "The photograph. It disappeared last night. And now..." Her voice broke as she gestured toward the mirror's reflection. "There are more of them." Harris took the photo from her, studying it closely. His jaw tightened. "Damn it," he muttered. He dug into his folder and pulled out the official police copy of the same image, the version that had been in the case file for decades. He placed them side by side. The difference was undeniable. The police version was clean, empty, unremarkable. But in Margaret's version, the figures in the mirror were growing. Harris exhaled sharply. "I don't know what the hell is going on here, but I don't like it." Margaret's fingers clenched the blanket. "I need to know the truth, James." He hesitated before nodding. "Then you need to hear this." He opened his folder, flipping through documents. "I started digging into Richard Whitmore like we talked about. The man was as respected as they come. Prestigious ballet instructor, beloved in the community, no criminal record. On paper, he was perfect." Harris paused, his lips pressing into a thin line. "But he wasn't." Margaret's breath caught. "What do you mean?" Harris placed a newspaper clipping in front of her. The article was old, yellowed with time, the headline faded but still readable. "Acclaimed ballet instructor involved in scandal? Unconfirmed reports suggest possible cover-up." Margaret's fingers traced the words, her pulse quickening. "I don't remember this article." Harris nodded. "You wouldn't. It was buried almost as soon as it was printed. The newspaper retracted it the next day. Someone powerful made sure it disappeared." Margaret's mind raced. What did it say? Harris flipped to another page. The reporter who wrote it, Daniel Reeves, claimed that Whitmore had been acting strangely in the weeks leading up to the disappearance. He canceled rehearsals without explanation, avoided public appearances, and even attempted to resign from the academy. Margaret's stomach twisted. "Resign?" Harris nodded. But the academy wouldn't accept it. He was their star instructor. Whatever made him want to leave? It was big. Margaret's fingers gripped the blanket. Did Daniel Reeves ever write anything else about it? Harris hesitated. No. Margaret frowned. Why not? Harris's gaze darkened. Because 3 days after the retraction, Daniel Reeves went missing. A chill ran down Margaret's spine. No. Yeah, Harris said grimly. And guess what? His case went cold, just like Emily's. Margaret's hands trembled. Are you telling me that whatever happened to Emily, to those girls, might have happened to him too? I don't know, Harris admitted, but the timeline is too close to ignore. He rubbed a hand over his face. There's more. I found records of a property Whitmore owned outside the city. Private ballet studio. He never listed it publicly, never mentioned it to anyone. But get this, the deed transfer happened the same week he tried to change his name. Margaret's breath hitched. He was hiding something there. Harris nodded. And I think we need to find out what. Margaret swallowed hard. Take me there. Harris hesitated. Margaret, I don't care how sick I am. She cut him off. I'm not spending another day lying in this bed, while the answers I've been searching for my entire life are out there waiting for me. Her voice wavered, but her determination was unwavering. Take me there, James. Harris exhaled sharply, running a hand through his graying hair. He knew better than to argue. All right. That evening, Harris helped Margaret into his car. The drive was long, the road winding away from the city and into the countryside. The air grew colder, the sky darkening as they approached the location. The studio sat on a secluded property, hidden behind towering trees, the building's architecture old but eerily pristine. Margaret's chest tightened as Harris parked. The studio had been abandoned for decades, yet something about it felt untouched, preserved. Harris turned off the engine. Are you ready for this? Margaret's hands trembled, but she nodded. Let's go. They stepped out into the crisp night air, the gravel crunching beneath their feet. The front door was locked, but Harris forced it open with a crowbar. The inside was coated in dust, but beneath the decay, the structure of the studio was intact. Mirrors lined the walls, their glass coated in grime. The wooden floor creaked beneath their steps. Margaret's breath hitched. It was exactly as she had seen in her dream. Her eyes drifted to the far end of the room, where a single grand mirror stood taller than the rest. She moved toward it instinctively, her pulse hammering. Harris followed close behind. Margaret reached out a trembling hand, wiping at the dusty glass. And then, a whisper, soft, faint. Mom! Margaret gasped, stumbling back. Harris caught her, his own face pale. Did you hear that? Margaret nodded, her heart racing. She turned back to the mirror, and that's when she saw it. Not her reflection, not Harris's, but Emily, standing on the other side. Margaret's breath caught, her eyes burning with tears. Emily. Emily's lips parted, but no sound came out. Her expression was pained, desperate. Her hands pressed against the glass. Margaret's own hands moved instinctively to meet hers, but as soon as they touched the mirror, a deafening crack split the silence. The mirror fractured down the middle, splintering into a web of cracks. And just like that, Emily was gone. Margaret collapsed to her knees, her chest heaving. No, no, no. Harris knelt beside her, his face pale. Margaret! She gripped his arm, her eyes wild. She's in there. Her voice shook with certainty. She's trapped in there. Harris stared at the shattered mirror, his expression unreadable. Then we need to find a way to bring her back. Margaret's body trembled as she looked at the broken glass, her reflection distorted, unrecognizable. For the first time in 32 years, she had seen her daughter, and now she would do whatever it took to bring her home. Margaret sat on the cold wooden floor of the abandoned ballet studio, her chest rising and falling in rapid, uneven breaths. The mirror before her stood shattered, the jagged cracks distorting her reflection into something unrecognizable. Emily had been there. She had seen her, felt her, and then, just as quickly as she had appeared, she was gone again. The weight of the moment pressed against Margaret's ribs, suffocating her with a grief so profound it felt unbearable. But she wasn't imagining things. She knew what she had seen. Harris knelt beside her, his own face pale with shock. His fingers hovered over the cracked mirror, his gaze flickering between the fractured glass and Margaret's tear-streaked face. Margaret, he said carefully, as if afraid of his own words. What just happened? Margaret swallowed the lump in her throat, her hands trembling as she wiped at her damp cheeks. She was there. Her voice wavered, barely a whisper. Emily was right there. Harris ran a hand down his face, exhaling sharply. I saw something too, but... He hesitated, his cop instincts battling against the impossible. Margaret, we need to think this through. Margaret turned to him, her eyes burning with an intensity that made him pause. No, James, we don't need to think. We need to act. He sighed. And do what exactly? What are we dealing with here? Margaret's fingers clenched into fists. I don't know, she admitted, but I can't just walk away from this. Not now. Not when I've finally seen her. Harris hesitated, then nodded. All right, let's start with the facts. He gestured to the shattered mirror. This place, it meant something to Whitmore. He kept it hidden. He tried to disappear before the girls went missing. And now, after all these years, this is where you saw Emily. Margaret's breath hitched. You think this place is connected to what happened? I don't think it's a coincidence, Harris admitted. Whatever Whitmore was involved in, it led back here. Margaret's gaze drifted back to the broken glass. The reflections were strange, fragmented in ways that didn't make sense. It felt wrong, like the pieces of the mirror didn't just reflect the present, but something else, something older, something lingering. She reached out a trembling hand, fingertips brushing over the cracks. The moment her skin made contact, a whisper echoed through the empty studio. Soft, familiar. Mom! Margaret gasped, jerking back. Harris was instantly at her side, his grip firm on her arm. What is it? She shook her head, her pulse hammering. She's still here. Harris's face darkened. We need more than feelings, Margaret. We need proof. Margaret's jaw clenched. Then let's find it. They searched the studio, moving through dust-covered rooms filled with relics of a past long forgotten. Rusting ballet bars lined the walls, the wooden floors still bearing the marks of countless dancers' steps. But it was the far corner of the studio that drew Margaret's attention. There, hidden beneath a tattered sheet, was a grand piano, untouched by time. Margaret hesitated before reaching for the fabric. She pulled it back slowly, revealing the polished black surface beneath. Dust coated the keys, but when she pressed one, the note rang out, clear and sharp. The sound sent a chill down her spine. Harris frowned. What is it? Margaret's hands hovered over the keys. Emily used to play. A long silence stretched between them. Then, just as Margaret was about to step away, the piano keys pressed down on their own. A single note, soft, melancholic. Margaret's breath caught. Then another note, and another, a melody, a song. Emily's song. Margaret's hands flew to her mouth as tears welled in her eyes. She knew this melody. It was the piece Emily had been practicing for months before she disappeared. Harris took an instinctive step back. Jesus! The melody played for a few more haunting seconds before fading into silence. Margaret turned to Harris, her voice breaking. Do you believe me now? Harris's jaw tightened. He was a man of logic, of reason. But what he had just witnessed defied all explanation. He nodded once. Yeah, he said hoarsely. I believe you. Margaret wiped at her tears, determination settling in her bones. Then let's figure out what the hell is going on. They spent the next hour combing through the studio, searching for anything that might give them answers. Harris found a locked drawer in Whitmore's old office, rusted shut from years of neglect. After several forceful tugs, it finally gave way, revealing a collection of aged documents and photographs. Margaret reached for the topmost paper, her fingers unsteady. It was a letter. Richard, you cannot undo what has been done. The contract was made. The performance will continue whether you run or not. Do not forget, once they take the stage, they belong to it. Margaret's breath turned shallow. What does this mean? Harris's fingers tightened around the paper. A contract. He sifted through the documents, pulling out more letters, more notes, all with similar warnings. And then, at the bottom of the drawer, a single photograph. A stage. A performance. And in the background, a grand, gilded mirror. identical to the one Margaret had seen in her dream. Margaret's stomach twisted. Harris exhaled sharply. "This isn't just a disappearance case, Margaret." He met her gaze. "This is something else." Margaret's pulse pounded. The whispers, the mirror, the contract, it was all connected. She turned back to the shattered glass, the fractured reflections staring back at her. Emily had given her a clue. She had to find the mirror, and she had to do it before it was too late. The car ride back to the city was steeped in silence. The weight of what they had uncovered at the abandoned ballet studio pressed heavily upon Margaret's chest. A truth too vast and terrifying to fully comprehend. The contract, the mirror, the music that had played itself. It was impossible, and yet, Margaret could no longer deny what she had seen, what she had felt. Emily wasn't gone. She was trapped. She turned to Harris, his hands gripping the steering wheel tighter than necessary, his knuckles white. He was shaken, more than he would ever admit. Margaret's voice was quiet, but firm. "We need to find that mirror." Harris exhaled sharply, keeping his eyes on the road. "You realize how crazy this sounds, right?" Margaret clenched her hands in her lap. "Do you still think I'm crazy?" Harris didn't answer right away. Instead, he stared out at the dark road ahead, the streetlights flashing past in rhythmic intervals. Finally, he sighed. "No," he admitted. "I don't." Margaret looked back out the window, her mind racing. The pieces of this puzzle were slowly coming together, but there were still too many missing fragments. What had Richard Whitmore done? Why had he tried to change his name? And what had truly happened to Emily and those girls that night? When they arrived back at the hospital, Nurse Sarah was waiting at the entrance, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. "Margaret," she scolded the moment she saw her. "You cannot just leave like that. You need rest." Margaret ignored her, walking past without a word. There was no time for rest. Not now. Back in her hospital room, she spread out the documents they had taken from the studio, poring over each one with meticulous focus. Harris helped, sifting through old newspaper clippings and handwritten notes. It was late, well past midnight, but neither of them spoke of sleep. And then Margaret found it. A name, written in careful, deliberate script at the bottom of one of Whitmore's letters. Eleanor Whitmore. Margaret's breath hitched. His wife. Harris's brows furrowed. "I didn't know he had a wife." Margaret's heart pounded. "Neither did I." They searched through the records, but there was nothing about her. No public records, no obituaries, no mentions of her in the papers. It was as if she had never existed. Margaret looked at Harris. "If anyone knows what happened, it's her." Harris nodded. "I'll find her." The next day, Harris made calls, digging through every available database. Took hours, but eventually he tracked down an address. A nursing home. Margaret insisted on going with him. Despite Sarah's protests, despite the worsening ache in her bones, she refused to stay behind. This was her daughter. This was her truth. The nursing home was a quiet, sterile place, the kind that smelled of disinfectant and fading memories. They were led down a long hallway to a private room. Inside, sitting by the window in a wheelchair, was Eleanor Whitmore. She was old, frail, her skin pale and paper-thin, her silver hair pulled into a loose bun. But her eyes were sharp. She looked up as they entered, and then she smiled, as if she had been expecting them. "Mrs. Whitmore?" Harris asked gently. She nodded. "I knew someone would come eventually." Her voice was soft, yet unwavering. Margaret stepped forward, her fingers trembling. "My name is Margaret Holloway." She swallowed hard. "My daughter was one of the ballerinas who disappeared." Eleanor studied her for a long moment. Then, she nodded. "Yes," she said simply. Margaret's breath caught. "You know what happened." Eleanor's gaze drifted to the window. "I was Richard's wife for many years," she said quietly. "I loved him, but I never truly knew him. Not until it was too late." Margaret and Harris exchanged a glance. Eleanor's hands tightened over the blanket on her lap. "The ballet, it was his life. More than me. More than anything." She exhaled, as if the weight of those words had been suffocating her for decades. But he was obsessed with something else too. Perfection. Margaret's heart pounded. What do you mean? Eleanor's gaze was far away now, lost in the past. He always said that a perfect dancer never leaves the stage. Margaret's blood ran cold. Eleanor turned back to her, eyes dark with sorrow. He made a deal. Harris leaned in. A deal? Eleanor nodded. I don't know how. I don't know with whom. But I know this: he believed that perfection could be eternal. That if a dancer was truly great, they wouldn't just perform. They would become the performance itself. Margaret's voice was barely above a whisper. The mirror. Eleanor's gaze sharpened. Yes. Margaret's fingers dug into her palms. Where is it? Eleanor hesitated. It was hidden after that night. No one wanted to touch it. But I know where it is. She looked at Margaret, something unreadable in her expression. If you go looking for it, you must understand. It may not be something you can undo. Margaret's hands trembled. I don't care. Eleanor's lips parted. Then slowly, she nodded. The theater, she said. The one where they were supposed to perform. The mirror was never removed. Margaret's breath caught. The theater. The place where it all began. Harris stood. Then that's where we're going. Eleanor's voice stopped them before they could leave. One last thing, she said. Margaret turned back. Eleanor's eyes burned with something fierce. If you step onto that stage, be careful. Margaret nodded once. And then, she and Harris left, the weight of Eleanor's words pressing against their chests. The past was waiting for them, and this time they would face it head-on. The theater loomed before them like a forgotten monument, its grandeur dulled by time, its once bright marquee now nothing more than rusted metal and shattered glass. Margaret stared up at it from the passenger seat, her chest tightening. How many times had she walked through those doors, full of pride, watching Emily rehearse with the other girls? How many times had she sat in the audience, her heart swelling with every graceful movement of her daughter's body as she danced? This place had been Emily's dream, and now it was her tomb. Harris turned off the engine, his fingers tightening around the steering wheel before he let out a slow breath. It's been abandoned for years. No one comes here anymore. Margaret swallowed hard. Then we won't be disturbed. Harris didn't respond. Instead, he reached for the glove compartment, pulling out a flashlight. He hesitated, then looked at her. Are you sure about this? Margaret's voice was steady, even as her hands trembled in her lap. She's here. I know she is. Harris sighed but nodded. Then let's find her. The doors were locked, rusted chains wrapped around the handles, but Harris had come prepared. With a few forceful strikes from a crowbar, the metal links snapped, and the chains fell to the ground with a heavy clatter. He pushed open the doors, and a wave of dust and stale air greeted them. Margaret stepped inside, her pulse hammering. The foyer was just as she remembered. Ornate chandeliers now coated in grime, velvet curtains faded and moth-eaten. The scent of old wood and forgotten memories clung to the air. But it was the silence that unnerved her most. A place like this should have been filled with echoes, of voices, of footsteps, of the faint hum of a city beyond its doors. But it wasn't. It was as if the theater existed outside of time, untouched by the world around it. Harris moved ahead, scanning the room with his flashlight. Where would they have kept it? Margaret didn't hesitate. The main stage. They walked through the lobby, their footsteps muffled by thick layers of dust. The grand doors leading to the auditorium creaked as Harris pushed them open, revealing rows upon rows of empty seats, all facing the vast, dark stage. Margaret's breath caught. The theater had always been beautiful, but now it felt wrong, like it was waiting for something. She stepped forward slowly, her pulse quickening with each step. The floorboards beneath her feet groaned, the sound stretching through the emptiness. The air grew colder, sharper, with every inch closer to the stage. And then, a whisper, faint, barely audible. Mom! Margaret froze, her breath hitched in her throat. She turned to Harris, but his face told her everything. He had heard it too. Harris gripped the flashlight tighter, sweeping it across the room. Where did that come from? Margaret swallowed, her voice barely above a whisper. The stage. They moved forward, the vast, yawning darkness of the theater swallowing them whole. The closer they got to the stage, the heavier the air became, thick with something unseen yet palpable. It was as if the theater itself was alive, watching. Margaret reached the edge of the stage and placed a trembling hand on the wooden surface. It was cold, too cold. Harris climbed up first, then turned to help her. As soon as her feet touched the stage, the entire room shifted. The silence deepened. The air became heavy, suffocating. And then, a soft hum. Music. Faint, distant, but unmistakable. A ballet melody. Margaret's fingers dug into Harris's arm. Do you hear that? His face was pale, his jaw tight. Yeah. The music grew louder, filling the vast auditorium, seeping into the walls. Margaret's breath quickened. It was the same melody Emily had played on the piano, the same one that had echoed in the abandoned studio. Her gaze darted around the stage, searching, desperate. And then she saw it. At the far end of the stage, half covered by an old velvet curtain, stood a mirror, tall, ornate, gilded. It was identical to the one in her dream. Margaret's feet moved before she could stop them. She walked toward it, drawn by an invisible force. Harris followed close behind. When they reached it, Margaret reached out a trembling hand, wiping away the thick dust. The glass beneath was smooth, flawless. And then, the reflection shifted. Margaret gasped. It wasn't just her and Harris staring back at them. There were others, figures, silhouettes, standing behind them, watching. Margaret's chest constricted. Her pulse pounded so loudly she could barely hear herself think. She turned sharply, expecting to see someone behind them, but the stage was empty. She looked back at the mirror. The figures were still there, and then one of them stepped forward. Emily. Margaret choked back a sob. Emily, she whispered. Emily pressed her hands against the glass, her eyes wide, pleading. Mom, she mouthed. Margaret reached for her, her fingertips brushing the cold surface. Emily, I'm here, she said desperately. Emily shook her head, her expression panicked. Then, she lifted a trembling hand and pointed. Margaret followed her gaze to the bottom of the mirror. There, carved into the gold frame, were words. Once they take the stage, they belong to it. Margaret's breath hitched. Harris read the words aloud, his voice tight. This is what Eleanor was talking about. Margaret's heart pounded. It's a prison. Emily nodded. Tears blurred Margaret's vision. How do I get you out? Emily's lips parted. But before she could answer, the music stopped. The room fell into deafening silence. And then the mirror shattered. Margaret screamed as shards of glass exploded outward, forcing her to stumble back into Harris. The force of the impact sent them both tumbling to the floor. The air crackled with something unseen, something ancient. And when Margaret looked up, Emily was gone. The mirror broken. The reflection empty. Margaret's hands shook as she pushed herself up, tears streaming down her face. No, 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 she sobbed. She was right there. She was right there. Harris gripped her shoulders, his own breathing uneven. Margaret, but she shook her head, her voice breaking. I saw her, James. I saw her. Harris's jaw clenched. I know. Margaret wiped her tears, her body trembling. We have to fix this. Harris hesitated. I don't know how. Margaret looked at him, her eyes blazing with desperation. Then we find a way. She turned back to the shattered mirror, her hands clenching into fists. This wasn't over. Not yet. Margaret sat on the stage, her breathing ragged, her hands trembling as she stared at the shattered remains of the mirror. The fragments were scattered across the wooden floor, reflecting slivers of dim light from the rusted chandeliers above. The mirror was gone. The reflection was gone. Emily was gone. Again. Her chest ached, the weight of helplessness pressing against her ribs like a vice. She had seen her daughter, had reached for her, and in an instant, she had been ripped away once more. 32 years of unanswered questions, of sleepless nights spent staring at a ceiling that never gave her any peace, of hope that had turned to despair and then to acceptance, only for the wound to be torn open again. "Damn it," Harris muttered beside her, rubbing a hand over his face. He was still catching his breath, his expression a storm of disbelief and frustration. "What the hell just happened?" Margaret turned to him, her voice raw. "She was right there, James." Her fingers clenched against her lap. "She was right there." Harris shook his head, staring at the broken glass. "I don't understand this. I don't understand any of this." Margaret exhaled shakily, trying to steady herself, but it was useless. Nothing about this was normal. Nothing about this could be explained by logic or reason. Something had happened in this theater all those years ago. Something that had trapped Emily and those girls inside that mirror. And now the mirror was broken. Margaret's throat tightened. "What if I made it worse?" she whispered. "What if she's lost forever now?" Harris looked at her, his expression conflicted. But before he could say anything, a sound echoed through the auditorium. A slow, deliberate creak. Margaret froze. Harris's grip tightened around his flashlight. What was that? Margaret turned toward the rows of empty seats, her pulse hammering. The theater was abandoned. No one had stepped foot in it for decades, but the sound had been unmistakable. Someone or something was there. The air grew colder, pressing against her skin like an unseen force. A shiver ran down her spine as she scanned the darkness beyond the stage. The seats stretched out into an endless void, their velvet cushions faded with time, the aisles coated in a thick layer of dust. And then, a shadow moved. Margaret's breath caught. It was barely perceptible, a flicker in the darkness, but she saw it. A figure, standing between the rows, watching. Harris aimed his flashlight, but the beam barely cut through the thick air, illuminating only dust and empty seats. "Who's there?" he called out, his voice steady but cautious. Silence. Then, another creak. Closer this time. Margaret's heart pounded. She couldn't see anything, but she felt it. Presence. An undeniable weight pressing down on her chest, suffocating her. And then, from the darkness, a voice. Soft. Familiar. "Mom!" Margaret gasped. Her head snapped toward the sound, her eyes wide. "Emily?" Harris swore under his breath. "Margaret!" But she was already moving. Ignoring the fear clawing at her throat, she stepped off the stage, her legs unsteady, her breath uneven. The rows of seats stretched before her, silent and unmoving. And then, in the farthest corner of the auditorium, she saw her. Emily, standing in the aisle, her ballet slippers barely touching the floor, her delicate frame bathed in pale light. Her eyes were wide, filled with something unreadable. Fear, longing, a silent plea. Margaret's breath shuddered. "Emily," she whispered. Emily lifted a trembling hand. "You have to go." Margaret's brow furrowed. "What?" Emily shook her head, her expression urgent. "You have to leave. Before it sees you." Margaret's pulse spiked. "Before what sees me?" But Emily was already backing away. Margaret surged forward, reaching for her. But Emily disappeared, gone, like a whisper in the wind. Margaret stumbled, her heart hammering. "No, no, no," she gasped. She turned wildly, searching, but the aisle was empty. She had just been there. Harris reached her side, gripping her arm. "Margaret, we need to go. Now." Margaret shook her head violently. "No, she's here. I saw her." Harris's jaw tightened. "And she told you to leave." Margaret hesitated. Emily had warned her. "Before it sees you." Margaret's blood ran cold. Harris tugged her arm. "We're not staying here any longer." Margaret let him lead her back toward the stage, her mind reeling. They needed to leave, but she couldn't. Not really, because if Emily was here, then so was something else. They reached the theater's entrance, and Harris shoved the doors open, the night air rushing in like a flood of relief. Margaret stumbled outside, her legs weak beneath her. She turned back toward the theater, her chest heaving. The building stood tall and unmoving, its facade as lifeless as it had been when they arrived. But something was different now. The marquee, long abandoned, its letters rusted and barely hanging in place, had changed. Margaret's breath caught in her throat. There, in old, faded letters, were the words, "Final performance, one night only." Margaret's skin prickled with a deep, paralyzing fear. Harris saw it too. He let out a slow breath, his hands resting on his hips. "Jesus!" Margaret turned to him, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's not over." Harris met her gaze, and for the first time, she saw true fear in his eyes. "No," he said quietly. "It's not." Margaret's fingers curled into fists. She had lost Emily once. She wouldn't lose her again. Margaret sat in the passenger seat of Harris's car, staring at the words on the broken marquee. The rusted letters, half hanging from the decayed sign, shouldn't have been possible. They had been gone when they arrived, erased by time and neglect. And yet, now they stood there as if freshly placed, glaring at her like a silent warning. Final performance, one night only. She felt Harris's eyes on her, waiting for her to speak, to offer an explanation, but she had none. Her throat was tight, her breath shallow. She had been prepared for many things. Ghosts, memories, regrets. But this was something else. Something far worse. Harris exhaled sharply, rubbing a hand over his face. "All right," he muttered. "That's enough for one night." Margaret didn't argue as he started the car and pulled away from the theater. The city lights were a blur outside the window, but she barely saw them. Her mind was trapped in the past, caught between the moment Emily had vanished and the moment she had reappeared, whispering warnings through the darkness. "Before it sees you." Margaret's fingers dug into the fabric of her hospital gown. She wasn't leaving this alone. Not now. Not when she was closer than she had ever been. "We need to go back," she whispered. Harris's knuckles whitened on the steering wheel. "Margaret, I mean it, James. We need to go back." Harris let out a harsh breath. "And do what exactly? We barely made it out of there, and I don't even know what the hell we saw." Margaret turned to him, her voice breaking. "Emily is still in there." Harris's jaw clenched. "I know." "Then we can't stop," she said. "Not now. Not when we're this close." Harris didn't respond immediately. His face was tight, tense, like a man at war with himself. He pulled the car into the hospital parking lot, shutting off the engine but making no move to leave. Silence stretched between them, thick and suffocating. Finally, he turned to her. "You know this isn't just about Emily anymore, right?" Margaret frowned. "What do you mean?" Harris looked back at the theater in the distance, its silhouette dark against the city skyline. "Something's wrong with that place. Something that goes beyond logic, beyond reason. Whatever happened to Emily and those girls, it wasn't just a disappearance. It was something else. Something unnatural." Margaret swallowed hard. She knew he was right. Every part of her screamed that this was no ordinary case, no ordinary mystery. And yet, that only made her more determined. "I don't care what it is," she said finally. "I just want my daughter back." Harris sighed, long and slow, then nodded. "All right, but we're not going back unprepared." Margaret frowned. "What do you mean?" He turned back to her. "We need answers, Margaret. Real answers. We need to know exactly what we're dealing with before we walk back into that theater." Margaret hesitated, then nodded. "Where do we start?" Harris's eyes darkened. "With the last person who saw them that night." Margaret's breath caught. "Evelyn Carter." Harris nodded. "If anyone knows what happened before that bus disappeared, it's her." The next morning, they tracked Evelyn down. It wasn't easy. She had left the city decades ago, burying herself in a quiet town on the outskirts, far from prying eyes. But Harris was relentless, and by noon, they were standing outside a small, weathered house with peeling paint and overgrown grass. Margaret's stomach churned. If Evelyn had been hiding all these years, she had a reason. Harris knocked. Silence. He knocked again, harder, A shuffling sound came from inside, then the slow creak of a door opening. A woman stood there, older now, her thin frame draped in a heavy sweater despite the heat. Her eyes, sharp and wary, flicked between them. "I don't talk about it," she said immediately. Harris didn't hesitate. "We know about the mirror." Evelyn's face went pale. The door slammed shut. Harris swore. Margaret stepped forward, pressing a hand against the wood. "Please," she said, her voice desperate. "My daughter was one of them." Silence. Then, slowly, the door cracked open again. Evelyn's eyes searched Margaret's face, as if looking for something. Then, with a resigned sigh, she stepped aside. "Come in," she murmured. The house was small, cluttered with books and photographs, but it was clean, lived in. Evelyn led them to the kitchen, gesturing for them to sit. She didn't offer coffee or tea. Instead, she sat across from them, her fingers twisting anxiously in her lap. "I always knew someone would come looking," she admitted. "I just hoped I wouldn't be around when they did." Margaret swallowed. "You saw what happened that night." Evelyn's gaze was distant. "I didn't see everything, but I saw enough." Harris leaned forward. "Tell us." Evelyn hesitated. Then, she let out a slow breath. "I was working late that night, cleaning near the theater entrance. I saw the bus stop at the intersection. It just sat there. No movement, no sounds. At first, I thought it had broken down. But then, I saw him." Margaret's breath hitched. "Who?" Evelyn's hands trembled. "Richard Whitmore." Margaret's blood ran cold. "But he was supposed to be on the bus." Evelyn nodded. "He was. But that's not what I saw." She swallowed. "I saw him standing in the street, just staring at the bus, like he was waiting for something." Margaret's fingers dug into her lap. "And then," Evelyn's voice dropped to a whisper, "the bus disappeared." Harris's brows furrowed. "What do you mean, disappeared?" Evelyn's eyes darted to the window, as if making sure no one was listening. "I mean, it was there 1 second, and the next, it was gone. No sound, no flash, just gone." Margaret's breath turned shallow. Evelyn met her gaze. "And Whitmore?" He just turned and walked away, like nothing had happened. Harris's face darkened. "And no one questioned this?" Evelyn let out a bitter laugh. "I tried. I told the police, but they dismissed me, called me crazy. A week later, I started getting phone calls. No one spoke, just breathing. And then, my apartment was broken into. Nothing was taken, but every mirror in my house had been shattered." Margaret shivered. Evelyn shook her head. "I knew then that I had to leave, so I did." Margaret's throat tightened. "Do you know what happened to the girls?" Evelyn hesitated. "I don't know for sure, but I have a theory." She leaned forward, lowering her voice. "I think they were taken by the mirror." Margaret's breath hitched. Evelyn nodded. "And if that's true," she met Margaret's gaze, "then breaking it wasn't the way to free them." Margaret's heart pounded. "Then what is?" Evelyn's expression turned grim. "You have to finish the performance." Margaret's pulse skidded to a halt. "What?" Evelyn's fingers trembled. "That mirror. It wasn't just a mirror. It was a stage." Margaret's blood turned to ice. Evelyn's voice was barely above a whisper. "If they never finished the performance, then they never left the stage." Margaret's stomach twisted. To bring Emily back, she would have to complete the dance. Margaret sat frozen in Evelyn's dimly lit kitchen, her heart hammering in her chest. The words echoed in her mind, their weight pressing down on her like a stone. If they never finished the performance, then they never left the stage. She had spent 32 years searching for an answer, for an explanation, and now she had one. The girls hadn't just disappeared. They had been taken, trapped in a performance that never ended, in a mirror that wasn't just a mirror. It was their stage. Her breath shuddered as she looked at Evelyn. "How do we finish it?" Evelyn hesitated, her fingers curling around the edges of her chair, as if she was trying to hold herself together. "I don't know," she admitted. "I only know what I've pieced together from what I saw that night. The mirror was always the key. But breaking it, that might have made things worse. Margaret's stomach twisted. She had shattered the mirror in the theater, and in doing so, she might have locked Emily and the others away forever. Harris, who had been silent until now, let out a slow breath, rubbing a hand over his face. So what you're saying is, we have to complete a ballet that hasn't been performed in 32 years? Evelyn nodded. Yes, and it has to be the exact same performance they were supposed to do that night. Margaret's pulse pounded. That means we need the choreography, the music, everything. Harris glanced at her. And the dancers. Margaret's breath caught. The realization sank in like ice in her veins. The girls had been taken, but their spirits, trapped reflections, lost echoes of the past, were still in the theater. What if they could bring them back? She turned to Evelyn, her voice shaking. Did you ever hear of anything like this happening before? Evelyn hesitated, then nodded slowly. There's a legend, an old one, something whispered among dancers for generations. Margaret leaned in. Tell me. Evelyn's voice dropped to a whisper. They called it the last dance, a performance so perfect, so mesmerizing, that the dancers became a part of it. It wasn't just about the steps. It was about devotion, sacrifice, a performance that never truly ended. Margaret's hands trembled. That's what happened to them. Evelyn nodded solemnly. And if you want to bring them back, you have to finish what was started. Margaret's breath turned shallow. The idea was impossible, insane, and yet, every instinct in her body screamed that it was the truth. She turned to Harris. We have to go back to the theater. Harris looked at her, his jaw tight. Margaret, no, she interrupted, her voice firm. I've spent 32 years waiting for this moment. I've spent 32 years mourning my daughter, not knowing where she was, not knowing if she was alive in some way or if she was lost forever. And now I know she's there. I won't leave her, James. Harris exhaled sharply, then ran a hand through his graying hair. Damn it, he muttered. Then, after a long pause, he nodded. All right. Margaret turned back to Evelyn. Will you help us? Evelyn hesitated, then slowly shook her head. I can't go back there. I left that place behind a long time ago. Margaret's heart sank, but she understood. Evelyn had carried the secret for decades, and now Margaret was asking her to walk back into it. Still, Evelyn reached across the table, gripping Margaret's hand tightly. Be careful, she whispered. That theater is not what it seems. Margaret swallowed hard and nodded. That night, she and Harris returned to the hospital only long enough for her to gather her things. She knew she wasn't coming back. One way or another, she was going to finish this. Harris drove them back to the theater in silence. The streets were empty, the city quiet, as if the world itself was holding its breath. When they arrived, the theater stood just as they had left it. The rusted marquee still bore the ominous words. Final performance, one night only. Margaret's stomach churned. It's waiting for us. Harris nodded grimly. Then let's not keep it waiting. They entered through the front doors, the dust swirling in the beam of Harris's flashlight. The silence was suffocating, pressing against them like a physical force. Margaret's steps were slow, measured, as she moved toward the stage. She could feel it, the weight of unseen eyes, the presence of something lingering in the air. She took a deep breath and whispered, Emily. No response. Margaret turned to Harris. We need the music. Harris nodded and moved toward the orchestra pit, searching for anything that might still work. Margaret, meanwhile, stepped onto the stage, her hands trembling. She closed her eyes. She could almost hear it, the echoes of the past, the laughter of the girls, the voice of Richard Whitmore calling out instructions, demanding perfection. And then, a flicker. Margaret's eyes snapped open. There, at the edge of the stage, stood Emily. Margaret's breath hitched. Emily. Emily's expression was pained, desperate. Mom, she whispered. You don't understand. Margaret took a step forward. Then tell me. Emily's eyes filled with something raw, something agonizing. It's not just us. Margaret frowned. "What do you mean?" And then, a shadow moved behind Emily. Margaret's stomach dropped. A figure emerged from the darkness, stepping onto the stage beside Emily. Tall, elegant, cold. Richard Whitmore. Margaret's blood turned to ice. Whitmore's gaze settled on her, his expression unreadable. "You shouldn't be here." Margaret clenched her fists. "Where are they?" Whitmore tilted his head. "They never left." Margaret's chest tightened. "Let them go." Whitmore sighed. "It's not that simple." Emily turned to Margaret, her eyes pleading. "Mom, you have to finish the performance." Margaret's heart pounded. "How?" Whitmore stepped forward, his voice eerily calm. "You dance." Margaret's breath caught. "I can't." Whitmore smiled. "Then they stay." Margaret's hands trembled. Every instinct screamed at her to run, to leave this cursed place behind. But she couldn't. She turned to Harris, who had finally found an old recording in the orchestra pit. Their ballet, their final performance. Harris met her gaze. "Are you sure?" Margaret exhaled shakily. "Start the music." And then, the theater came alive. The chandeliers flickered. The dust lifted, swirling like unseen hands were brushing it away. The stage lights glowed bright, as if the past itself was rewinding. Margaret stepped forward. She hadn't danced in years. Her body was weak, her bones fragile. But she had no choice. For Emily, for the girls, for the performance that never ended. And as the first note played, she began to dance. Margaret took a trembling breath as the first note echoed through the vast, empty theater. The old record crackled, but the melody remained intact. A haunting, delicate waltz that had once filled this space with life. Now, it was a ghost of its former self, a whisper of something long forgotten, waiting to be finished. Her heart pounded as she stepped forward, her feet touching the smooth wooden stage, worn down by decades of performances. She wasn't a dancer, not like Emily, not like those girls. But this wasn't about perfection. This was about bringing them back. She lifted her arms, mimicking the movements she had seen Emily practice so many times in their living room. In front of mirrors, lost in her own world. Margaret had watched, had clapped, had encouraged, but she had never stepped into that world herself. Until now, her body resisted at first, stiff with age, the weight of time pressing against her bones. But she moved anyway, slowly, carefully, and then the air changed, a hum soft but growing. The dust that had settled for decades lifted in swirling patterns, caught in an invisible current. The lights above flickered once, then twice, before glowing steadily, illuminating the stage in a golden haze. Margaret swallowed hard. She could feel it, the presence, watching, waiting, and then she wasn't alone. A figure appeared beside her. Then another, and another. Girls in white ballet dresses, their movements fluid, weightless. They twirled, they leaped, silent, graceful. Their faces were blurred at first, shadows flickering through the golden light. But then, as the music swelled, Margaret saw them clearly. The missing ballerinas. Her breath hitched, and at the center of them, Emily. Margaret's throat tightened as she watched her daughter move. As light as air, her feet barely skimming the floor. Emily turned, her gaze locking onto Margaret's. And for the first time in 32 years, Margaret saw her daughter's eyes filled with something she had feared was lost forever. Hope. Margaret reached for her, but Emily shook her head, her lips parting. "Dance, Mom," she whispered. Margaret's pulse pounded. This wasn't about reaching her. This was about finishing what had been started. Margaret steadied herself, ignoring the pain in her joints, ignoring the weight of time pressing against her. She followed Emily's movements, step by step, letting the music guide her. And then, the world around them shifted. The empty theater blurred. The walls shimmered, their edges fading, transforming. The dust vanished, the old velvet curtains lifting as if by unseen hands. The broken seats repaired themselves, filling with shadows, silent figures watching from the darkness. Margaret's breath shuddered. She was no longer in the abandoned theater. She was in their theater. The one from that night. The night they disappeared. Emily spun in a perfect pirouette, her movements effortless, and the other girls followed. The performance was seamless, mesmerizing. Margaret followed, her feet stumbling at first, but the music held her up. She danced because she had no choice, because this was the only way. And then, a voice, cold, smooth. "You should have left." Margaret turned sharply. Richard Whitmore stood at the edge of the stage, watching her with an eerie calmness. He was exactly as he had been that night. Tall, composed, his silver hair neatly combed, as if time had never touched him. Margaret's chest ached with fury. "You did this." Whitmore tilted his head. "I gave them eternity." Margaret's hands clenched into fists. "You trapped them." Whitmore sighed, stepping forward. "Perfection comes at a cost. They knew that." His gaze flickered toward Emily, admiration in his eyes. "She was my best." Margaret's rage burned. "She was mine." Whitmore's smile was slow, calculated. "Then finish the dance." Margaret's breath hitched. The music swelled. She turned to Emily, who was still dancing, her movements slowing as if waiting for Margaret to catch up. Margaret took a deep breath. And then, she moved. Her feet followed the steps as best as they could, her arms lifting, her body flowing with the rhythm. The pain in her bones, the stiffness of age. It all faded. The music carried her, guided her. And the moment she fell into sync with Emily, the lights above flared. The air vibrated. The figures in the audience leaned forward, their empty faces watching. And then, a sharp crack. The mirror, what remained of it, began to glow, its broken shards rising from the floor, reassembling themselves, piece by piece. Margaret's chest heaved. This was it. The music reached its final crescendo. The girls moved as one, their bodies bending, spinning, completing the final movement. Emily turned to Margaret, her eyes filled with something Margaret couldn't yet name. And then, the last note played. The music stopped. Silence. Margaret's body stilled, her chest rising and falling with ragged breaths. The stage around them flickered. The figures in the audience wavered, their shadows stretching, pulling, and then, just like that, they were gone. The golden glow faded. The theater returned to what it was, old, abandoned, broken. Margaret stumbled, the weight of exhaustion pressing against her. But then, a whisper, soft, gentle. "Mom." Margaret turned. Emily stood before her, real, breathing, whole. Margaret's breath shuddered as she reached out, her fingers brushing against Emily's cheek, warm and solid. A sob escaped her lips as she pulled her daughter into her arms, her body trembling. Emily clung to her, her own sobs muffled against Margaret's shoulder. "You came for me," she whispered. Margaret pressed a kiss to her hair. "Always." A hand touched her shoulder. She turned to find Harris, his expression stunned but relieved. Margaret swallowed hard. "They're gone." Harris nodded. "Yeah." "And Whitmore?" Margaret glanced toward the edge of the stage. But he was gone. No trace, no sound, nothing. Just an empty theater. The nightmare was over. Margaret tightened her hold on Emily, her breath uneven. 32 years. 32 years of grief, of unanswered questions, of pain. And now, she had her daughter back. Emily pulled away just enough to meet her eyes. "Mom!" Margaret cupped her face, memorizing every feature, every detail. "I'm here," she whispered. Emily smiled. And for the first time in decades, Margaret smiled too.